In terms of terrorism, it certainly has been 4 separate attacks, obviously coordinated fairly thoroughly. 2 on the World Trade Center here in New York, 1 on the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., a 4th, the hijacking and crash of a plane, as you just saw, outside Pittsburgh. Unclear now as to how many lives have been lost, but the numbers are bound to be staggering as the day progresses.
Aboard those airplanes alone, 266 people have lost their lives. That was confirmed by both United and American Airlines, and we are unclear, as Matt just said, about the perhaps thousands of people who have been killed and certainly injured as a result of what happened in New York City and outside Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon. With more, here's Tom.
This is an NBC News special report. Here is Tom Brokaw.
September 11th, the year 2001, a day unlike any other in the long course of American history, a terrorist act of war against this country. President Bush saying today that freedom has been attacked by a faceless coward and freedom will be defended. Not since Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941, has this country undergone such a devastating and damaging attack. And it may not yet be over. We do know at this time that at least 4 targets have been attacked. The 2 Twin Trade Tower centers here in New York City, the Pentagon, and then another plane that was crashed deliberately into an area outside of Pittsburgh. That is the 2nd plane hitting the Twin Trade Towers this morning, all of them hijacked airliners. Then these 2 colossal icons of the American capitalist system collapsed in lower Manhattan. The death toll at this hour is unknown, but it is expected to be, as Mayor Giuliani has said, horrendous. Shortly after those attacks on the Twin Trade Towers in New York City, at the Pentagon, in one of the outer rings, another hijacked airliner crashed into 2 areas there, killing an untold number of U.S. military personnel in Washington, D.C. A code red was put in effect in the nation's capital. The White House, State Department, CIA evacuated along with the Pentagon. House Speaker Dennis Hastert was evacuated to a secure area. President Bush, who was in Florida for an appearance for an education project, was evacuated to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where we do expect to hear from him before too long. The United States is in effect in a national state of emergency. All domestic flights were grounded immediately. Most flights that were already in the air, we believe, will arrive safely at their destinations. The borders between the United States and Canada and the United States and Mexico have been closed. Transatlantic flights were diverted to Canada. U.S. military forces in this country and around the world have been put on the highest possible alert. Aircraft carriers were moved to waters off New York City as this scene played out in the nerve center of this country, lower Manhattan, the financial markets, an area that is home to literally hundreds of thousands of people. They are still dealing with the carnage in lower Manhattan. We want to go now to NBC's David Bloom, who is in Midtown Manhattan, overlooking all of this. As you can see there, communications have been severely interrupted. David?
Well, Tom, what we're looking at behind us more than 4 hours after the first explosion is the smoking hulk of the essentially vanished World Trade Center. As you've said, the essential question at this hour in New York City is how many people may have died in these attacks. The various officials here in New York City believe that the casualty estimates will essentially go into the thousands and thousands of people. Here is the sequence of events as they happened at this hour. The first plane attacks the World Trade Center's South Tower at approximately 8:42 Eastern Time. Airline officials say at least 2 American Airlines flights and 2 United Airlines flights were hijacked today, and that the attack planes were the hijacked domestic flights. Roughly 21 minutes later, approximately 9:03 Eastern Time, the second large jetliner can be seen taking dead aim at the World Trade Center's North Tower. Emergency officials estimate 20,000 or more people may have been inside the 2 110-story buildings at the time of the attacks. Eyewitnesses report victims falling and in some cases jumping from the two buildings. At approximately 9:40 a.m. in Washington, D.C., a third hijacked plane crashes into the Pentagon in a burst of flames, one side of the building collapsing. Non-essential personnel from federal buildings, including the White House and the U.S. Capitol, are evacuated. 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. An unknown number of people still trapped inside. 1/2 hour later, at approximately 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. Rubble, debris spreading for blocks. In a separate but apparently related crash, a fourth hijacked plane, a Boeing 767, crashes in western Pennsylvania, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. The FAA closes all domestic airports, shutting down all U.S. airspace. So again, Tom, 4 hijacked airplanes. We know what happened to each of the 4. Other officials investigating now, both apparently the worst terrorist attack in the mainland United States ever. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's David Bloom. What we don't know is who may be responsible for these attacks. There's a lot of speculation, obviously, about Osama bin Laden, who is a Saudi dissident who is believed to be harbored somewhere in Afghanistan, but no one is claiming responsibility. In the West Bank, however, the Palestinians in the streets are cheering and celebrating these attacks on the United States, even though Palestinian leaders have condemned the attacks. We want to go now to NBC's Pat Dawson, who is down near the World Trade Center, because the big question, obviously, in New York City and across this country, how many people have been able to survive this horrendous attack? Pat?
Tom, right now, hundreds of rescue workers are massed here on the southern tip of New York in Manhattan Island, waiting for a possibility where they can go back in large numbers to begin searching through the debris. Obviously, the first task at hand will be to find anyone who is still alive in there. There really is no precedent for this. 2 110-story buildings. First of all, the impact of those 2 planes into them, and then the buildings themselves literally tumbling down into the streets. It's the sort of thing that one assumes very few people could have survived. But the task of those rescue workers, and if you look behind me, you can see many of them massed down there. The task will be for them to go back in and to try to find anyone who is alive. First of all, that is, of course, the priority. They know. We have spoken to a number of them. Of course, common sense tells us as well they are going to find a very, very high number of dead bodies in there as well. No way. We have spoken to officials here with the police department and with fire. They all say the same thing. This kind of a catastrophe, there's no way of knowing how many people that they're going to find in there, how many people are dead, how many people are alive. There's really no way to know how difficult their task is going to be going in there and trying to dig through the remains of 2 110-story buildings that are now lying at the bottom of Manhattan. Obviously, taking care of those that are hurt that they have been able to get out is a first priority. There are literally, I would say, probably a mile-long line of ambulances and rescue vehicles along this stretch of the West Side Highway in the lower part of Manhattan. Just on the right here is a community college in New York. That college is the triage center for those they've been able to take out. But I can tell you at this point that at least from this vantage point where we have seen most people going in and out, there have been, relatively speaking, very few ambulances going out of here in the last 3 to 4 hours. Tom?
All right, thank you very much, Pat Dawson. One of my colleagues who is right in the middle of the collapse of those buildings is CNBC's Ron Insana, who went down with a cameraman hoping to get close to the World Trade Center, and then it began to come down, the first one. Ron, take us through what you experienced.
Well, Tom, much of the area had been, in fact, cordoned off, and the cameraman from MSNBC and I were trying to get across to the west side of the World Trade Center in order to hook up with the rest of the NBC crews that we knew were there. As we were moving towards the building, we saw the top begin to blow out in a plume of smoke, and we heard the noise associated with an implosion. We turned and immediately ran for cover in the other direction as debris began to rain down. As we made our way, John going straight down the street, I taking a right turn around a corner, it got increasingly dark. The skies blackened as the material just continued to rain down. I hid briefly behind a car, and as the material got thicker and thicker and it became increasingly difficult to breathe, I got inside a parked car, a random parked car, and hid there basically until the material stopped falling. It was pitch black, black as night inside that car, and for several minutes I remained there until some flickers of light were able to be seen. I made my way to a building and joined some police officers who were inside, and as the blackness began to lift and this gray, thick smoke clung in the air, we were able to find a police car and make our way out of the area. The policeman stopping along the way to pick up 2 injured people and leave them at a Midtown hospital, and subsequently made my way here.
What about collateral damage to other buildings in the area? Those, of course, are the classic canyons of lower Manhattan, and as that building came down, it did create a kind of tornadic wind that went through there.
Absolutely. Much like the images that were created for the movie Independence Day, when New York was exploding, the corridors of lower Manhattan are so narrow and channel so much wind, even just on a plain windy day, that this material blew through in a way that was really unimaginable. It was truly frightening. It continued to rain down for several minutes, as you can see there, and the winds just whipped through these corridors for several minutes, eventually calming down to such an extent where there was just a thick gray haze throughout the entire area, Tom.
All right, thanks very much, CNBC's Ron Insana, who was right in the middle of it all today. New York City effectively has been shut down. All tunnels in and out of the city have been closed for security reasons. The airports are closed. The subways are closed. Traffic has been removed from the streets. All hospitals are on extra alert. One right kind of in the middle of it all at ground zero is St. Vincent's Hospital. And NBC's Robert Bazell is there, as he has been all morning. Robert, any additional word on casualties?
Well, Tom, actually there have been about 200 casualties, some of them very severe, at least 8 deaths, and 5 of those were firefighters or policemen. We're not sure which one. But one of the things that's amazing about being here is that it has been much slower than anyone anticipated. That's a lot of casualties, of course, and but the casualties have been coming out of lower Manhattan at a much slower speed than people anticipated. I think just because as one rescue worker who had been down there told me, it's just hell down there. You can't move around. You can't discern who's a body part from a living human being in several of the areas. So we have a very dedicated staff standing by. Large numbers of medical workers are ready to attend to anybody who appears.
Bob.
Several have been very severely injured, but we're still waiting.
All right, Bob, we now have the videotape of President Bush, who was diverted from Florida to Barksdale Air Force Base near Shreveport, Louisiana. This is what he had to say to the nation moments ago.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status, and we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested, but make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
President George W. Bush, in his capacity today, not only as President of the United States, but also as Commander-in-Chief, as U.S. military forces around the world are on the highest possible alert. There is so much uncertainty in this situation. Who is responsible? When it could happen again, and where? These are questions that are still unresolved as we try to work our way through this day. I'm joined on the telephone now by the former National Security Advisor in the Clinton administration, Sandy Berger, a longtime veteran of national security matters in this country. Mr. Berger, in all of your contingency planning during your days in the White House, did you ever anticipate anything like this, 4 hijacked airliners that would be driven into the Twin Trade Towers and the Pentagon?
Well, Tom, I think for some time we have known that terrorism is the greatest security threat that this country faced. We've seen some horrible incidents here before. We broke up a multi-pronged effort on Millennium Weekend, but this certainly goes beyond anything that we have seen before in its dimensions and sophistication.
As we work our way through this day of shock and grief and still trying to count the number of casualties, we also have to say, however, that there has been a stunning failure of intelligence at the highest possible level. The American people are going to wonder why they spent billions of dollars of intelligence if we can't find out about a complex operation like this that involves so many people.
Well, I think all of that is going to have to be sifted out. I think that in the midst of our outrage and anger, President Bush is right. We have to show the world that we will respond to this both with determination and with steadiness. That means first, obviously, focusing on security and on rescue, then on determining who's responsible. And this is of such magnitude that it's inconceivable to me that we will not soon know what the origin of this is, and then how we did not detect this, since it obviously involved a multiple operation based on from the United States. But blame, I think, the blame game, I think, comes, in my judgment, after we do everything we can to take care of the people who are in those buildings. We assure the security of others who may be in situations that are vulnerable, and we find out who is responsible for this absolutely horrifying set of events.
Mr. Berger, it's just not a matter of assigning blame. That's not the question. The question is, how do we get our intelligence back on track so it doesn't happen again in the next 20 minutes or the next 20 hours?
Well, I think we have to recognize that this is the overwhelming security threat to the nation, more so than any foreign nation, more so than long-range missiles. Terrorism has been and continues to be the #1 threat to our people. I think the intelligence community has intensified its efforts over the years, but this simply demonstrates that we're certainly not doing enough.
Sandy Berger, thank you very much for being with us today on what is obviously a day of great trial for this country, a great tragedy, and we have to determine how we go from here once we do begin to sort out just how many lives were lost, who is responsible for all of this, and how we can protect ourselves from this kind of attack again in the future as it continues to play out across America. Robert Knowles is on the phone with us now. He was on the 54th floor, I'm told, of one of the World Trade Center buildings when one of the planes was flown into it. Mr. Knowles, you're safely at home?
Yes, sir.
Could you turn down your television? I can hear it in the background, and that will cause us some problems if we continue our discussion. Okay. Tell me exactly where you were and what happened to you.
I was on the 54th floor.
Of #1 building or #2?
#1 building.
Uh-huh. And when were you first aware of the attack?
Well, something hit the building, and it knocked me to the floor. And then the whole window blew out of the office I was in. And it snatched the desk out of the office like it was a piece of paper.
And how did you get out of that office?
By the grace of God, I was holding on to the door so I wouldn't be sucked out the window.
And then did you go down the stairs?
Yeah, going down the stairs was really rough because it was from the 30th floor down. It was water. The sprinklers was on, and then I pray to God for the people in the wheelchairs because they couldn't get out. They were sitting there waiting for somebody to carry them down.
How many people did you see like that, Mr. Knowles?
2 people. They were invalids. You know, they couldn't get out the wheelchairs. It wasn't a regular wheelchair. It was the kind of wheelchair where they do everything in a wheelchair.
It was a heavy mechanical wheelchair of some kind.
Yes, sir.
And then as you made your way to the bottom of that stairwell, was crowded with other people trying to get out?
Yes, sir, but God bless the fact that it happened early, because if it had happened at 10:30, it would have been chaos because you couldn't get down the stairs. Between the smoke and the lights being out in the water, and the staircase was slippery.
When you finally got to the ground floor, then what happened?
Then they herded us out of the building. They told us to walk fast. We walked up towards Broadway, up Nassau, and it was glass blown from everywhere.
When you were in your office when the first explosion occurred, that was the first building that was hit.
Yes, sir.
And were there lots of people in the building at that hour?
It was a good amount of people, but not lots.
It was not full to capacity?
No, thank God.
And were there other people who, so far as you could tell, were either seriously hurt or killed in the first explosion that you could find?
No, everybody I seen was mobile. They were able to get out the building. You know, people were coughing, people fell on the stairs. They weren't hurt from the explosion. They were hurt trying to get out of the building.
Okay, Mr. Knowles, we wish you the very best, and by the grace of God, you were able to get out of there, and we know that this has been a difficult time for you, but we thank you for sharing your experience with us today.
Thank you.
Going to go to Washington now. Senator John McCain, who has declared this an act of war on the United States. It's already being described as a kind of 21st century Pearl Harbor. Senator McCain.
I think that's accurate in many respects, Tom, although clearly the implications of this are very significant, and including the fact that at least we knew exactly who it was that took these actions against the United States at Pearl Harbor. And obviously at this point we don't know who it was or which organization or nation may have been sponsoring this kind of activity.
We're obviously in the early stages dealing still with the shock and the grief, trying to count the number of casualties, but this country will have to take immediate action in terms of how we rearrange ourselves now to hope that we don't have this happen again. We're going to have some profound changes in America, Senator.
I'm afraid so. I think that our lifestyles will not be the same for a very long period of time because of security requirements. I also think that, as I was watching you earlier, there is going to have to be an evaluation about our intelligence capability, and part of that evaluation will be recognition that we don't have the kind of human intelligence capabilities that perhaps we need. We have excellent technical capabilities, but a lot of times you have to have someone on the ground to penetrate these organizations so you can know their intentions rather than their actions. But look, this is a terrible, unspeakable act. I believe the American people will rally behind and support the President of the United States, and I believe that we will find out who did this, and I think we will respond. And I don't know how you could describe it, very frankly, any other way but an act of war.
You grew up in the conventional military, and we have such an investment in all of that, but for some time, national security officials across all administrations have been saying the great threat to this country is terrorism. Have we devoted enough attention to this kind of an act?
It's very difficult for me to second guess. I think there's going to be plenty of that kind of activity. I would repeat that when I talk to people in the field and when I travel around the world, our lack of human intelligence capability. Part of that is the difficulty in penetrating some of these organizations. As you know, they're very difficult. But That may be an area that would have to be addressed. Our technical capabilities, our satellites and others are absolutely superb and sometimes phenomenal. But you've got to divine people's motives. As I said, you've got to get these things before the act is being carried out, and that's probably an area that we have to look at. But I'm sure that this administration and the Congress will devote all their efforts to making sure not only that the people who perpetrated it are punished, but also that it never happens again.
Senator, is it too early to speculate on whether or not we're going to need protective air cover over the nation's capital in some of our more critical areas?
I don't know. I do know that average citizens are going to find it a much more complicated process going to an airport and getting onto an airplane. That'll be one of the first, obviously, one of the first and necessary evaluations that are needed, because I think it's pretty clear now that these planes were hijacked, and how they were able to do that in the case of at least 4 airplanes is going to be a subject of great interest and perhaps some controversy, because there's been this issue of security at airports for a long period of time. How much inconvenience versus how much security, which has been one debate that's been in Congress and in other areas of government as well. So I think that rather than attacking it from having air cover over the Capitol, perhaps we ought to devote our efforts to going places where these acts of terror originate. That would probably be much more effective and cost-effective as well.
Senator, we're still dealing, as I say, with the initial stages of shock, but in fact, it is hard to overstate the magnitude of all of this or the continuing effect that it will have on the business of this nation.
Oh, I don't. There's never been anything like this in our lifetime. Pearl Harbor was a horrible and dastardly deed, and I don't like to compare it to Pearl Harbor. But this is unprecedented in its scope and frankly, its efficiency.
Senator John McCain, thank you very much for being with us today.
Tom.
Thank you. Under these very difficult circumstances. It's also worth pointing out that in Pearl Harbor, it was a military attack on a military installation. This was an attack by terrorists using innocent American civilians, for the most part, in hijacked airliners directed at targets filled with civilians, with the exception of the Pentagon, obviously. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now for an update. 4 planes hijacked today, Bob. 2 United, 2 American. Bring us up to date.
With a total toll just in the airplanes, so thousands dead presumably on the ground, but just in the airplanes, 266 dead. As you said, 2 American planes, 2 United planes. 2 of those planes were taking off from Boston, 1 from Newark, and 1 from Washington Dulles. 2 went into the World Trade Center buildings, 1 went into the Pentagon, and 1 crashed in rural Pennsylvania with no idea where that one was being hijacked to. At last report, and this report was about 40 minutes ago, there were now only 50 planes left in the air, 50 commercial flights over domestic U.S. airspace. So that is saying no new flights were being allowed to take off, haven't since 9:30 Eastern time this morning. The planes that were already in the air were allowed to continue on. There were only 50 of those still in the air. They were mostly about 20 minutes away from airports, so presumably almost all of those should have landed by now. There were also 22 international flights still in the air, heading here initially. The word was they were going to be diverted to Canada, and then the decision was made that that would be just too hard for Canadians to handle, and so those 22 flights were going to be allowed to land in the U.S. So far, we don't know of any of them landing. But this is a very important point. The FAA knew of no problems with any of those 50 planes still in the air in the U.S. or 22 in international airspace bound here. So that would seem to indicate that the problems are over in terms of these hijackings. Just to run the flights down very quickly, the first was an American airliner, Boston to Los Angeles. There were 92 killed on board that one. It went into the World Trade Center. That was the first event. Then there was a United plane leaving from Boston. 65 were killed on it. It also went into the World Trade Center. It, too, as the American plane before it, was supposed to have been bound Boston to Los Angeles. Then there was an American airliner leaving from Dulles Airport bound for Los Angeles, 64 aboard, and it crashed into the Pentagon. And finally, a United flight leaving Newark Airport bound for San Francisco. It went into rural Pennsylvania, so we don't know what its intended target was. Now, in terms of what Senator McCain was talking talking about, when you think of a plane being hijacked, you've got to get the hijackers aboard, and you have to get some sort of deathly weapon aboard, like a gun or some explosives. And there are two ways to do that. Either they go through passenger screening and manage to sneak through passenger screening without getting caught, or you get behind the doors somehow and sneak those people aboard behind passenger screening as though they were an airport employee. There have been investigations done on both those things. The FAA tests them a lot with plainclothes people to see if they get through, and every time they do it, a sizable percentage do get through passenger screening with mock weapons or mock explosives. And the same thing on the employees behind the lines. A sizable number do manage to get through the doors. So we'll be seeing in coming days what it was that led to all this. Tom?
Bob, any indication from the FAA of radio traffic indicating that there was a hijacking underway?
No, what it is in the cockpit, presuming that an armed person, in the course of a hijacking, an armed person or somebody with explosives has broken into the cockpit, and the pilot, therefore, cannot say it over the open radio because the hijacker would take action against the pilot. So there's a button that you push, and the button sends out a code, and it tells the appropriate air traffic controllers, and word is flashed to Washington immediately that there's a hijacking in progress. So one could presume that that happened in all 4 of these flights. Of course, we don't know at the moment, but it certainly must have. Then you wonder, too, because the targets were hit so precisely, is that somebody standing behind a pilot and saying, okay, now fly this right into a World Trade Center tower? Or is it an experienced pilot, the hijacker himself, who gets the pilot out of his seat and takes over at the controls to guide it in at the last minute? We don't know, of course. Yeah.
All right, thanks very much. NBC's Robert Hager, who will be monitoring the airline part of all of this. The 4 hijacked airliners, in effect, became guided missiles in the hands of terrorists who hijacked the plane. They took innocent people to death with them, 266 altogether. President Bush is at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana at this time. We're told other senior members of the Bush administration are in secure positions. There's code red at the Capitol right now. House Speaker Dennis Hastert was removed to a secure position. All financial markets have been closed down. All national monuments have been evacuated. Across America, in places like Minneapolis, Kentucky, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, a number of critical installations have been closed down as well. This country, the most powerful in the world, has been, in effect, semi-immobilized today by these terrorist attacks. And we can only hope that they are now all over with. When we heard this morning at 8:42 that the World Trade Center had been attacked, we thought that that was a single, a solitary and horrifying event. Not too long after that, the second one was hit. And then NBC's Jim Miklashevsky here on NBC said an explosion was felt at the Pentagon. And that was a plane that went into the Pentagon, another airliner near the Hillip pad there. It fortunately was on the far side of the building from the most critical offices housing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Intelligence Center, and of course Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, who at first did not want to evacuate the building, and then he was persuaded that that was in the best national interest of this country to do just that. And then, of course, we had the situation in Pennsylvania where a United airliner crashed into the ground. It, too, had been hijacked. James Lee Witt is the former head of the Federal Emergency Administration in the Clinton administration. He was well known during his tenure there because there were so many natural disasters around the country. Mr. Witt, what is FEMA doing at this hour?
Well, Tom, I'm sure that they've already activated the Operations Center and also talking to the City of New York Emergency Management and Governor Pataki's office in putting together whatever resources they can to support their efforts in meeting that immediate need. And I'm sure they're probably activating some search and rescue teams. Probably. Go ahead.
I know, James, from our own experiences together that you had lots of contingency plans for tornadoes and for hurricanes, those kinds of natural disasters. What did you have in planning at FEMA for a terrorist attack?
Well, of course, you know, after the Oklahoma City bombing, Tom, we've worked very hard in putting together a very strong federal response plan in which they have continued to work on, particularly adding the terrorist component to that, and working with the FBI, who will have the lead on this in crisis management. And, of course, FEMA has a consequence management, and I'm sure Director Albaugh and all the staff there are liaisoning with the FBI at this time.
Was that something that you prepared on your own, or did you do that in close coordination and get regular updates from the FBI?
We worked very closely with the FBI, and if there was a threat, then they would notify us and work very closely with them, and as far as having someone in their operations center.
When you look at those pictures of what happened in lower Manhattan, in the canyons of this great city with those two 110-story buildings coming down, you can only imagine what the carnage must be on the ground.
It's probably horrifying, and I saw earlier said it looked like a war zone, and I'm sure it does, and just looking at the pictures. But, you know, there's so many firefighters and police officers that were probably up at the base of that building, probably in that building, trying to get people out, and I'm sure that, you know, the loss is going to be tremendous, and the pain is going to be felt for a long, long time.
Jamie Lee Witt, thank you very much. By the way, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban movement on Tuesday said that Osama bin Laden, they are closely allied with him, was not responsible for the attacks on the United States. What happened in the United States, according to the Taliban, was not a job of ordinary people. It could have been the work of governments. Osama bin Laden cannot do this kind of work. Neither can we, a Taliban spokesman said from the southern city of Kandahar. The Taliban, of course, a very militant and very conservative Islamic organization, and widely believed to be harboring Osama bin Laden, a very wealthy Saudi dissident who has a very sophisticated apparatus at his disposal. He has not been seen for some time, although he does appear from time to time on some Islamic media outlets. One reporter who has been in touch with him said that 3 weeks ago he said an attack was planned on the United States, but that, of course, has not yet been verified. He is, at the moment, I think fair to say, at the top of everyone's list of suspects. But as we have learned on these occasions in times past, it's often not the best thing to do to make a premature judgment. There is the picture that we have often seen of him as he has declared a holy war against the United States. Let's go to General Norman Schwarzkopf now, who had the Southern Command and, of course, commanded the forces during the Persian Gulf War. General Schwarzkopf, I've been trying to review in my own mind the incidents in which the United States has been a conspicuous participant or absent in the past month or so. We lost a spy plane over southern Iraq. We've stepped up pressure on southern Iraq. Obviously, in the Middle East, in the ongoing dispute between the Palestinians and the Israelis, there's a great feeling that the United States is siding only with the Israelis. The war in Sudan goes on, but we've not taken an active role there. Are there any other signs on your radar screen that would indicate that this kind of thing was likely to happen?
Well, you know, Tom, the truth of the matter is that most of the Middle East countries consider the United States to be, you know, the main source of support for Israel. It isn't isolated just in certain states. And, you know, any one of those people, if you got them aside and asked them truthfully, they would tell you that they were not in favor of our policies with regard to Israel.
So do you think that that probably was the cause of all this continual escalation that has been going on between Palestine and Israel? And there's been an absence of participation, I think that it's fair to say, on the part of this administration and all that.
Well, I think that's kind of speculation at this time. I certainly think that you know, the reason why the United States is hated in so many places in the Middle East is with regard to the support of the state of Israel. And as a matter of fact, they'll openly state that if Israel had not had the support of the United States, it wouldn't exist today. So they go so far as to say that.
There are people, many people, still trapped.
When you and I were talking earlier, we were commenting on the sophistication of this attack and the complexity of that. Doesn't that stun you some?
It really does. I mean, just what was mentioned by, you know, by Robert Hager, the fact that undoubtedly, you know, I can't see any U.S. commercial airline pilot flying their plane directly into an obstacle like that. Undoubtedly, there was, you know, somebody at the controls that was able to guide the plane there. That in itself is kind of scary. I told you earlier about the fact that it bothers me that with all the devices we have against hijackers, that hijacking can still take place on this scale and organized in that fashion. That causes me concern. I certainly agree with what Senator McCain said about the fact that, you know, many years ago, we abandoned human intelligence. The attitude was that only bad guys have spies.
and good guys don't need spies, and we put satellites in the air, and we put a huge amount of investment into technical intelligence. At the same time, we dismantled human intelligence. I don't know what the status of that is today, but we damn sure need to get somebody inside these organizations. I would tell you that...
General, I'm just going to interrupt you for a moment because we're looking at some scenes that we have not yet had an opportunity to see. It does look like a nuclear winter in lower Manhattan. It is one of the most vital areas anywhere in the world, obviously. The home of the financial markets, the World Trade Center, lots of residences. There's been a real revival down there in recent years. And it has a great gray pall of dust and smoke and debris. And of course, overlaying all of that is the psychological effect of knowing that there could be a casualty list in terms of fatalities that could go into the thousands.
Yeah. I mean, Pearl Harbor, we lost 2,400. And, you know, when you hear the numbers today, it's hard to believe that we're not going to greatly exceed that number.
And as I pointed out earlier, in Pearl Harbor, it was a military attacking a military installation. This was the use of innocent people in commercial airliners to attack other innocent people in New York. There was one military target, obviously the Pentagon. You can see, if you're looking at this with me, General, the extent of the damage in lower Manhattan.
Yeah, unbelievable. Unbelievable. And you know, it's the natural inclination is, okay, we got to hit somebody back. And in this case, what's going to, you know, be even more frustration to the national psyche is you can't hit back. You know, you don't, who you're going to hit at this stage of the game.
Yep. Thank you very much, General Norman Schwarzkopf. We'll ask you to stand by. We'll be coming back to you. This is as effective as a bomb being dropped there. There were two bombs in effect. Commercial airliners flown into those two buildings, and they came down. We presume because of the initial explosion, there may have been secondary explosions as well that were detonated in the building by these terrorists. Robert Harper was one of those who was in the area when all of this occurred. Mr. Harper?
Yes. Tom, how are you today?
Tell me where you were when the first plane flew into the first building.
I was down below the World Trade Centers. I was arriving at work just a little late, and the first plane had crashed into the building, so there were many people, you know, sort of standing around. There were EMS workers running around as well, and you could see the second plane coming around and everyone sort of pointing up, and then that second plane just crashed into the building.
And what about people who were trying to get out of the building? We had one report of bodies falling through the air and people jumping from windows. Did you see any of that?
Absolutely, absolutely. It was a very traumatic day, I think, having seen that, because where the initial explosion was, there was a lot of black smoke coming out of around, I believe it was around the 78th floor, and you saw people jumping for their lives out of the 78th floor of the World Trade Center. Smoke everywhere, fire everywhere, and people were continuing to jump out of the 78th floor. So people began to run away because once the second explosion happened, the debris that was caused by that began to fall everywhere, and everybody just started running toward the mayor's office. You know, I began to run toward the Woolworth building, which was close to that, and then as I got closer to that, I realized if, you know, the top of the World Trade Center hit the Woolworth building, that building too would be affected, and it might also fall down.
Did you have a sense right away that these buildings could come down?
Not initially. For about 15 minutes or so, people only thought, you know, they couldn't really tell what had happened. And only after the second plane hit did people realize that, you know, this is probably something that was orchestrated. And so then people initially who had, you know, been trying to go back to the scene and try to help people realized that another plane had hit the building. And that's when people said, look, this can't have been a mistake.
Where are you now?
I'm outside of the emergency room at Presbyterian Hospital. I've just been released for smoke inhalation. I've been in the hospital there. They rushed me to the hospital, you know, not too long after that because the black soot and everything that was associated with the building. I mean, heavy black smoke engulfed the entire financial district. You know, from 9 o'clock onward, and we were sitting on the side of the road. EMS workers were there administering oxygen to people, thinking that everything was okay. And then as they began to realize that the explosion might have caused so much trauma to both the World Trade Center that they would fall, then everybody just began to run because they saw that the building itself was actually going to fall. So all of the people that had gone to help out were then put in, you know, double danger because you were then running, and the building literally came and fell over the entire financial district area there. It was a complete nightmare. Black smoke everywhere. People were running toward the Brooklyn Bridge, running away from the mayor's office, afraid that the falling part of the World Trade Center would hit other buildings, and that would cause a topple effect.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harper, and thank God you're okay, and I hope that you'll be able to deal with all of this. We do appreciate
it's been a real mess, and I can't, coming back in the ambulance, somebody said, one of the things that they remembered, thinking about is the date today is September 11th, so 9/11. So, it's something that can't really go without notice, is that this was completely planned, completely orchestrated. Whoever did this has been planning this obviously for a very long time.
Thank you very much, Robert Harper, who was one of the survivors who was just a little bit late to work this morning, but then got caught in the devastating attack on the Twin Trade Towers. It's hard for me to overstate to people who are unfamiliar with New York just how dynamic that area is in terms of people coming and going. The two towers are 110 stories high, or they were. 20 to 50,000 people would work in them at any one time. It's just a few blocks from the stock market and from many of the principal banks in America, to say nothing of residential areas. And we will not know for some time what the death toll is there, to say nothing of the number of people who have been injured, so many of them with burns. Let's go to Washington now, and NBC's Washington Bureau Chief Tim Russert. Tim, give us the state of play in the nation's capital right now. We know that the White House and the State Department and CIA have been evacuated. Dennis Hastert has been removed. Where is Dick Cheney at this hour? Do we know?
Tom, he is in a secure location. They won't tell us exactly, but I do know that he is there with his top-level aides. We have heard from some of those people. He has been in constant communication with the President of the United States and the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice. Tom, I've been speaking to people in the intelligence and law enforcement community, in and out, those who have served, those who are serving now. No one is the least bit surprised that there was a terrorist attack on the shores of America. Every person, to a man and woman, absolutely stunned, not only by the magnitude, but by the precision of this attack. They are absolutely convinced that there's only a few cells that could possibly have done this. And this is quite interesting because I didn't realize it until it was pointed out to me. Every one of the 4 hijacked planes that Bob Hager talked to you about was bound for California. In the words of this high-ranking official, the bastards knew they all had a plane full of fuel for the maximum impact upon collision. There is, in my experience in Washington, unprecedented anger here, but no one knows how or where to channel it. Right now, the situation is a bit chaotic. Communication is difficult, but the Bush administration is underscoring that the president is in charge, in command, in constant communication, and will bring these people to justice. They just know it's going to take a long, long time.
Tim, it's also going to be a test of the political maturity, if you will, of Washington. It's a city that has been so riven by what many would describe as petty political disputes. But this is one nation on this day.
Suddenly, the Social Security lockbox seems so trivial, Tom. One official said to me, Tim, your life is going to change, but more important, your son's life is going to change forever. America will never be the same after September 11th, 2001. The levels of security, heightened tension, the way we look at each other and look at our institutions will, in fact, be altered. That will bring some gratitude, if you will, to the terrorists. And that's why we as a nation, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, are, as they talk with one another today, are absolutely unified in their attempt to strike back, but also try to put salve on the national psyche so we don't become an armed camp resisting an enemy we really can't identify and never know when is striking.
Because the consequences psychologically for this country are every bit as great as they are physically for America as well. It is worth pointing out, I suppose, that we all breathed a great sigh of relief when the Cold War came to an end with the collapse of communism. And yet there was nothing as devastating as this for this country during that long, cold twilight that we faced down communism and Moscow with its considerable nuclear arsenal, which it still has in place, obviously.
You know, Tom, it's a very important point because all during this past few weeks, the debate about missile defense systems, many people were saying publicly, even those proponents or the detractors, well, you know, we're a long way from research on this, but there is a potential threat of a rogue nation launching a missile or an accidental launch from Russia or China modernizing their force. But everyone kept saying the true risk, the real risk is terrorist attack, and we plain don't know how to defend ourselves. But again, and let me underscore this, people are absolutely stunned, disbelieving that something so well coordinated, something is with a tick-tock like this, 4 hijackings within a matter of an hour, and then being able to take those very planes and drive them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And there is growing suspicion, Tom, here that the plane that landed, it crashed in Pennsylvania, was most likely headed for the Capitol or White House. That's the operating theory of many of the people I've spoken to today.
Thank you very much, NBC's Tim Russert. The equation has changed for all of us personally and professionally in the course of the last several hours, and we'll be dealing with this for a long, long time. But first, we want to take you through the eyewitness accounts of people who were witness to what happened here on a very sunny early fall morning in New York today. Some of the eyewitnesses.
I spent a year in combat. I never saw anything like this. Saw a lot of people die, but nothing this devastating.
We carried a bunch of people that we found laying in the debris. There was complete darkness. We stumbled over some people. We picked them up and carried them across the street.
You could hear the rumbling. When you looked up, you could see the top of the building just crumbling.
Then there was the haunting story from an eyewitness that we heard from a few moments ago of people in wheelchairs who were unable to get out of the building as he ran down the stairs, and he was obviously overcome with emotion as he described that for us. We don't have any numbers for you. We're trying to be as circumspect as we can be. All public officials are saying that they expect the final death toll to be horrendous. But this business of determining how many people are still in the rubble will take many, many hours, if not days, to determine. Here is a quick summary of what we have been through today in this country. On the 11th of September, the year 2001, at 8:42 this morning, first, one plane that had been hijacked crashed into the World Trade Center. Then, not too long after that, a second plane. About an hour later, the Pentagon was attacked by a hijacked airliner, and then came word that another hijacked airliner had crashed outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. When we saw the first reports and witnessed, those of us who live in New York, of the World Trade Center being hit by an airplane, at first all of us thought, I'm sure, that it had to be some kind of a terrible accident. And then, when we heard that a second plane, and you could see it flown deliberately into the World Trade Center, the horror of this terrorist war began to unfold, and it continues to unfold here now almost 5 hours later. And we'll be continuing to cover this across America and in the nation's capital. NBC's Pat Dawson has been not too far from the World Trade Center throughout most of the day, where it has been chaotic and terrifying. Pat?
Tom, as you point out, we try not to exaggerate very much in this circumstance, and yet in many ways it's hard not to exaggerate just the things we have been seeing and the things that we have been told. I think it is fair to say that the task that now confronts rescue workers here is Herculean, a very, very difficult task, and it is of two parts. It has been about 3 hours since what we might call the last catastrophic incident in a morning of catastrophes. That is since the North Tower of the World Trade Center, which used to stand behind me just about 10 blocks south, right below there. It used to tower above the buildings, which you can see, and obviously it is no longer there, nor is the South Tower. 3.5 hours since that happened. There have been no catastrophic incidents since then, but it has affected the rescue effort clearly because they are afraid of what could happen, what still might happen, since there were a sequence of catastrophes, if you will. That has made the rescue very, very difficult. At this point, we are being told unofficially that there may be as many as 200 to 300 rescue workers who are actually down there. We have seen pictures of some of them. They are down around the base of this building. They are beginning the, again to use that word, Herculean task of trying to find the people who might be alive in that debris. We know that there are a great number of people who are dead in there. Unquestionably, what they are hoping to find is survivors, and at this point they really can't speculate on how many there are, how many there could be, and I don't think it really serves us at this point to speculate on the numbers that it could be. One of the tasks, though, is to try to get this rescue effort in its entirety going, and as you can see behind me down here, there are probably hundreds of New York City and New York State and federal rescue people who are involved, fire, police, emergency service, quite a few. In addition to those, the task is certainly aided by the American Red Cross's disaster relief teams. They are here on the scene. This is Frank Donahue, who is with the American Red Cross. Frank, tell me first of all, as you start out here, what is it you're trying to do?
Well, our immediate purpose is to kind of assess what role the Red Cross can play initially, and certainly it's to help the emergency medical people that are here provide any kind of relief and support we can for them. People being evacuated from neighborhoods need a place to go, and the Red Cross is setting up service centers and shelters. There's one at Grand Central Station and Penn Station. And then the blood supply, making sure we have a safe blood supply, not only here, but throughout the country.
Do you have any idea, have you heard, how many casualties have been dealt with so far?
No, I have not. I'm sorry. I have not heard that.
Is it now part of your task, though, is also to provide blood supplies? Obviously, that will be needed in huge
Absolutely, and people throughout the country are responding. They should call 1-800-GIVE-LIFE. It's important to know that this incident, and you know, there's blood needed here in Altoona, there's blood needed all throughout the country that's been affected by this disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Another part is people that are moving around, are traveling today. No airport in this country is open, and so Red Cross volunteers are in every airport providing assistance to families. Families are calling the Red Cross here in New York as they are calling their local Red Cross to try to communicate and find the well-being of people that were in this building, as well as people in the other affected areas. So
you were also telling me about grief counseling and dealing with people who've been traumatized around the country, maybe at other airports.
Absolutely. Boston, for example, LAX, where those airplanes were coming from and headed to, we have Red Cross mental health worker volunteers there that are providing assistance to families. And again, that's happening throughout the country where people have been affected by this disaster. Here in New York alone, the Greater New York Red Cross has had lots of experience at the World Trade Center a number of years ago. Today, there's about 1,200 local Red Cross volunteers here in New York providing food and shelter, direction, and support to people that are incredibly affected by this incident.
And how many Red Cross workers do you think around the country?
Oh, a number of thousand, a couple thousand for sure. I know in Philadelphia, where I came from, we're on standby working with emergency management. It's the same thing in every major metropolitan area that Red Cross workers work closely with emergency management.
Frank, thank you so much for taking some time out. We appreciate it. That was Frank Donahue, the American Red Cross. Tom, that brings you pretty much as much information as we have here in what remains a fairly chaotic situation. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Pat Dawson. As the shock begins to wear down, we're going to all of us are going to have our patience tested as well as we await these reports. We'll try to deal with it as factually as we possibly can. It does now appear that the wave of attacks is over. We could not be certain of that just a few hours ago, as there were these reports of planes that were still in the air, some that had been hijacked, and their destinations were uncertain at that time. This is a live picture of Lower Manhattan, missing two of its most familiar profiles, obviously. The twin trade towers of the World Trade Center, iconic buildings here in New York, really representing, symbolic, if you will, of the enormous economic strength of this country. They sustained an attack in 1993. They were reopened. The country came back from that, and we went about our merry way again, thinking that in Fortress America, this couldn't possibly happen. But of course it has. Neil Livingston is one of the most widely recognized experts on international terrorism. Mr. Livingston, we keep coming back to the same issue. This was a very sophisticated attack. This was not just a lone suicide bomber of some kind. 4 hijacking simultaneously. Obviously someone in the cockpit who knew how to get the plane to the targets that they wanted to get them to. And it had to have happened over a long period of time, and they were all transcontinental flights loaded with fuel.
Tom, this is our worst case nightmare scenario, the one that we've hoped would never happen, and that would be a multiplicity of targets with a multiplicity of highly sophisticated bombs, in this case aircraft, and very symbolic targets. And so this great deal of thought went into this, a great deal of time and money. This kind of thing doesn't happen overnight. So we can anticipate that maybe a year or more was probably devoted to planning this attack, and there may be others coming.
Mr. Livingston, I remember that the FBI has been concerned for some time about the number of cells harboring terrorists in America that have been growing. Is that true?
Well, there clearly are a number of people in the United States that have been the beneficiaries of our relatively liberal immigration policy that have hidden within various communities here and have expressed very strong anti-American sentiments. Whether that can be translated into terrorism at this point is open to question. I would suspect that what we will see in this case are perhaps foreign nationals who have arrived in the United States strictly to carry out this mission, hijack these aircrafts, and take them to their targets. Very similar to what we saw in that millennial potential attack when a man was arrested at the border in Washington State who was going to carry out bombing attacks in the United States. He was an outsider who had been sent here to do that.
All right, Neil Livingston, thank you very much. I also have on the phone now Anthony Lake, Tony Lake, a former national security advisor to President Clinton, who's been a longtime student of the prospect of terrorism in this country, recently wrote a riveting fictional account of the various scenarios that the United States may have to deal with. But even in your most wildest imaginative days, Tony, you could not have anticipated something like this.
No, it's terrible. It's hard to say you can be lucky in any respect in something in such a catastrophe. But one of the great dangers still lurking out there is that it could have involved some kind of weapon of mass destruction.
But at the same time, it's hard to understate the amount of damage that has been done here physically and certainly in terms of loss of life. When you have an institution like the Pentagon attacked, the World Trade Center is attacked, and the plane that went to Pittsburgh might have been headed for the Capitol or the White House, for God's sake.
No, this is terrible. As I said, a catastrophe. Clearly a very sophisticated terrorist attack. Our intelligence community has headed off some in the past year or two. Their ability to evade our usual intelligence gathering methods in order to pull this off is extraordinary. And one question now we need to focus on is not only why did this happen, but where do we go from here?
Well, short term, if you were the national security advisor now back in your old office in the White House, what would be your recommendations in terms of a suppression of some of our normal liberties that we have in this country?
Well, we mustn't defeat our liberties in trying to defend them. I think what I would be urging now is, first of all, of course, get all the information we can immediately while dealing with the human dimensions of this catastrophe. And then thinking ahead, I think there are three fronts we have to act on. One, there must be, once we have identified the source of this, there must be an American response to this of some kind. Secondly, I hope that this will encourage us to even think in new ways about the nature of our security threats and increase our preparations, for example, for the Coast Guard in defending our ports against possible incidents like this, Customs, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and improving our organization for dealing with catastrophes like that. There's been progress on all these fronts, but not enough. And finally, and I think this is very important, we need to recognize that there is only one group out there that is trying to kill Americans, and that are these terrorists. We are at war with them, and it is not enough for us to attack simply on an American basis. We need to develop a global strategy for a global alliance, for a global war against these terrorists, including, for example, making sure that any nation pays a terrible price when it provides sanctuary for terrorists.
Thank you very much, Anthony Lake, former national security advisor to President Clinton, now an author and professor here in the eastern part of the United States. We were just told that the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, has stopped all civil flights over Great Britain, whether that was precautionary or in response to a threat that his government received. We cannot say, but all flights there have been canceled. Let's just take you through now a quick summary that does not begin to tell the true story of this day, but it is a kind of a checklist of what we've been through. 4 airliners, 2 American, 2 United, headed for California from Washington and Boston, were hijacked, 2 flown into the World Trade Center here in New York, 1 into the Pentagon, 1 crashed outside of Pittsburgh. The World Trade Center, 2 110-story buildings collapsed completely in lower Manhattan. We're showing you Somerset County, the airport near Pittsburgh, where the other United plane went down. All of this happened in the eastern seaboard, but that's just the geographical connection. This is a wound on America wherever you live, whatever your ideology may happen to be, unless you are in sympathy with the terrorist beliefs. And when those 2 twin trade towers went down, of course, that caused even more damage to lower Manhattan. At the same time, the Pentagon was attacked by one of the hijacked airliners. A number of dead in the Pentagon as well, in the outer rings, first and second rings near the helipad there. President Bush was diverted from Florida to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. We're told that Vice President Cheney is in a secure position. We don't know exactly where that is. The third in the line of succession is the Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert. He was told there's a code red, and he was taken to a secure position as well. All financial markets have been closed down. Hospitals in New York City over attacks. The world's largest, busiest city is at the moment all but shut down, with tunnels in and out of the city that have been closed for security reasons, traffic off the streets. 30 Rockefeller Plaza, where we work, and other midtown high-rise buildings have been evacuated for this day. All the subways are closed down. Across America, national monuments and other high-rises have been evacuated for the day as well as part of the precaution. Still, no claim of responsibility by any one group. The only visible signs of celebration have been on the West Bank. The Palestinian people, who believe that the United States and Israel are one, have been cheering and handing out candy and celebrating, while their leaders have been condemning this attack. NBC's David Bloom is in Midtown Manhattan now with a view over the city skyline. And David, it is still stunning for those of us who live here to look behind you and not see the twin trade towers.
Well, Tom, it is a horrific scene behind me, looking from Midtown Manhattan to lower Manhattan. And if anything, it's gotten more disheartening as the hours have passed. In this sense, the billowing cloud of smoke and debris that you see behind me is in fact growing. More smoke, more debris floating up into the air. The best estimates, Tom, that the New York Police Department is making at this hour in terms of casualties is only to say that they expect them to go into the thousands in terms of dead and injured. We know that the victims are being shipped to individual hospitals, not merely here in Manhattan, but in the entire tri-state area, in Connecticut, in New Jersey as well. One hospital, St. Vincent's in Greenwich Village, reports simply being overwhelmed with casualties. They say that they've put out an all-points bulletin for burn specialists and plastic surgeons that they need all the help they get, and it's no doubt all the hospitals do here in Manhattan. Here is the sequence of events, starting with the first terrorist attack this morning. The first plane attacks the World Trade Center's South Tower at approximately 8:42 Eastern Time. Airline officials say at least 2 American Airlines flights and 2 United Airlines flights were hijacked today, and that the attack planes were the hijacked domestic flights. Roughly 21 minutes later, approximately 9:03 Eastern Time, the second large jetliner can be seen taking dead aim at the World Trade Center's North Tower. Emergency officials estimate 20,000 or more people may have been inside the 2 110-story buildings at the time of the attacks. Eyewitnesses report victims falling and in some cases jumping from the 2 buildings. At approximately 9:40 a.m. in Washington, D.C., a third hijacked plane crashes into the Pentagon in a burst of flames, one side of the building collapsing. Non-essential personnel from federal buildings, including the White House and the U.S. Capitol, are evacuated. 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. An unknown number of people still trapped inside. 1/2 hour later, at approximately 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. Rubble, debris spreading for blocks. In a separate but apparently related crash, a fourth hijacked plane, a Boeing 767, crashes in western Pennsylvania, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. the FAA closes all domestic airports, shutting down all U.S. airspace. At this hour, airline and FAA officials believe the 4 hijacked planes include American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767, bound from Boston to Los Angeles with 90 passengers and crew aboard, crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 77, bound from Washington Dulles to LAX with 64 passengers and crew, believed to have been the plane, crashed into the Pentagon. United Airlines Flight 175, bound from Boston to Los Angeles with 65 people on board. By early accounts, the plane which crashed into the World Trade Center's North Tower. And finally, United Airlines Flight 93, the Boeing 757, which crashed in western Pennsylvania, carrying 45 passengers and crew. As to who might be responsible for this series of terrorist attacks, as you mentioned, Tom, has yet no claim of responsibility, but we certainly can tell you what senior U.S. intelligence officials, both in this administration and in the Clinton administration, are telling us, that the prime suspect is clearly the Saudi-born terrorist Osama bin Laden. One official told us that only he has the capability, the experience, and the motivation to carry out an attack like this. But again, that is just their initial speculation, finger-pointing. We clearly don't know at this hour who's responsible for this devastating and horrific attack.
Thank you very much, NBC's David Bloom. It goes without saying that whoever is responsibility, this is an act of war declared on the United States, a terrorist act of war, unprecedented in our nation's history. The United States was attacked, of course, 60 years ago this year at Pearl Harbor. 2,400 people were killed. The Japanese military attacking an American military installation that got us involved in World War II. But this terrorist war, they used innocent Americans on commercial airliners to attack other innocent Americans, and they struck at the heart of our civilian life in New York City. And they've caused great psychological damage across the country as well, say nothing of their attack on the symbol of our military strength, that is the Pentagon. And they took innocent people to their deaths in Pittsburgh in the crash of that hijacked airliner as well. NBC's Rahema Ellis is down near the World Trade Center. Rahema?
Tom, I am 4 blocks from the World Trade Center. The sky is dark with thick black smoke. Apparently, there are still fires burning. Some of the emergency workers told me that they cannot get into the exact area of the World Trade Center to help people whom they fear are trapped in the rubble because the fires are still burning, in some instances, out of control. Just a few moments ago, and just only 2 blocks from here, we were at the NYU Downtown Hospital. It is the only emergency room in the lower portion of Manhattan. It was the place where the first victims from this blast were taken, and hospital officials tell us they have turned their cafeteria into a triage area. They have people lined, and they say victims are wall to wall with inside that cafeteria and all throughout the hospital. Everyone has been called into service to assist in this blast. I talked with a man who was able to walk out of the hospital. His name was Peter DeCerbo. He was on the 47th floor of the World Trade Tower, number 1. He said when the first explosion occurred, he said he felt the building shake. He became frightened, as did all of his co-workers, he said. They didn't know what to do. Finally, he said, and quickly, they started to run down the stairs, 47 flights. And he said he actually carried a woman on his shoulders down those 47 flights with him. Another man who was on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange had come out of the building and was standing. He looked up, and he literally saw the second tower of the World Trade Tower come crashing to the ground. He said he saw it coming down, and then he and hundreds of people around him started to run. When he got to a point of some near safety, the man, who's 37 years old, said he dropped to his knees and he started to pray because he thought that he was going to be dead. As one emergency worker said to me, he said, "Do you know what day this is?" And I said, "It's September 11th. He said, "Yes, it's 911. And all of New York right now is in a state of 911. Tom?
All right, thank you very much. NBC's Rahema Ellis with a vivid account of what has been going on down there. We should also point out that we're getting a number of telephone numbers for people to call. Morgan Stanley has a very considerable facility in the World Trade Center. It's one of our premier investment banks, obviously, in America. And that number is 1-888-883-4391. For those of you who are in the New York area and may have families or friends who are employed by Morgan Stanley at the World Trade Center, some It's a small city, those two towers. Some 50,000 people at one time or another could be passing through there during the course of a day. This was to be the New York primary day to pick the candidate who may succeed Mayor Rudolph Giuliani. That election has been canceled. The mayor spoke with reporters moments ago.
Our focus now has to be on trying to evacuate as many people as possible, save as many lives as we possibly can, and make the city as secure as possible. The subways are running in the rest of the city. Lexington Avenue starting to run again, so people need to use the subway to get out of Lower Manhattan. They'll be able to use the subway. And we need people out of there so that the rescue efforts can go on all during the afternoon. I suspect they'll be going on through the night. And we'll be getting relief from the National Guard and the federal government later today.
Mr. Mayor, any indication on ballpark number?
I don't want to. Obviously, there are all kinds of numbers that are swimming in my head as to what the numbers must be, but I don't know. I have no idea what the numbers are. It's horrible. I think any of you that saw this have probably never seen anything like this before. That people jumping out of the building, and it's a horrible thing to see.
In terms of the police mobilization, maybe the commissioner can tell us how, what's going on downtown. Have you brought in additional cops, presumably from all over?
There's additional resources coming from all over the city. We've activated off-duty MOS to come in. We're getting the assistance of New Jersey and the outer line counties, and they're all kind of pushing in toward Lower Manhattan.
Are you either of you hearing anything from the federal government with regard to either what's going on in Washington or intelligence or anything out of the federal law enforcement?
The only thing that we've heard is what I guess is publicly available, that the Pentagon was attacked, that there were other apparent attempted attacks in other parts of the country, some of which were stopped. And I'm not sure I know how accurate all that information is, but it appears as if there have been either attacks or attempts to attack various parts of the United States.
Commissioner Bonnet?
That's Mayor Rudolph Giuliani of New York City. On that last point, he said that he had no confirmation of that. We have heard no word whatsoever of other attempted attacks across this country. Any number of states, as you might expect, and municipalities are on the highest possible state of alert. In Florida, Disney World has shut down and evacuated everyone from those facilities. That's been true of many of the entertainment centers in California as well. The Liberty Bell and Independence Hall have been closed, with other national monuments in the Philadelphia area. In Texas, some buildings were evacuated. Of course, all airports across America were closed down as well. In Washington, in Alaska, all military forces there are on the highest possible stages of alert. In Alabama, that's the home of the Redstone Missile Command Center, Marshall Flight Center. That has been closed today as well. No one knows if these terrorists might still attack again today. It does appear now, and I want to add a cautionary note to all of this. It appears now that this first wave of attacks is over. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now. Robert, do you know all the planes that were in the air that were not hijacked? Have they arrived safely at some destination?
That's a very, very important piece of information, and the FAA has just been able to confirm it, that the last of any scheduled domestic flights, last of the domestic flights that were in the air, are now known to have reached their airports. So there is no other domestic flight that's unaccounted for. The implication is there's no other hijacked flight up there, that this is over as an event. Now, having said that, there are some international planes still in the air. There were 22 as of about an hour ago. Now the FAA is saying that's down to a limited number. So apparently many of those have landed at this point. The remaining international flights, they're all inbound, are headed for the West Coast. So they were, initially the idea was to divert them to Canada, and then they said they should land in the U.S. So those planes are still in the air, but in terms of these domestic airliners, as you say, there were 4 hijacked, 4 hit targets, and 1 went into a rural area of Pennsylvania, so that accounted for all 4 known hijackings. Now at this point, any other plane that's still in the air, and this is all triggered by the fact that the FAA put a hold on any new flights leaving airports as of 9:30 this morning. So these are the leftovers of those that were already in the air. Now they're all on the ground and all accounted for, so there appears to be no more threat in the air. Tom?
Any indication from the FAA on when they may lift the grounding of all flights in this country?
There is absolutely none. And I suspect that in spite of the pain it will cause the nation, that this is going to last for quite some time, because I wouldn't think they'd want to put craft back in the air until they know more about how this all came about. So I'm imagining at a minimum that this is going to last into tomorrow and could be beyond that, as again, in spite of the economic hardship to the nation and hardship to people. But I think we're in for a long haul here in terms of grounding air traffic.
Yeah, thank you very much, NBC's Robert Hager. It does pose all kinds of problems because people travel for reasons other than vacation. Obviously, business, you can deal with that as well these days with the internet and with faxes. But what about funerals or medical emergencies of one kind or another? We'll have to find a way of dealing with that within our air traffic system in America, too. And you can be sure that security is going to change radically in the next 24 hours when you go to an airport, because 4 airplanes were hijacked today. And they were used as guided missiles, in effect, by terrorists attacking American institutions. This is also having an effect overseas. The stock market in Germany has been evacuated because of a bomb threat. And in Great Britain, the Prime Minister has banned all civil flights over that country. Let's go to NBC's Keith Miller now in our London bureau. Keith?
Tom, an extraordinary ripple of shock, anger, horrific went right through Europe. At least 3 governments went into cabinet emergency meetings. Tony Blair, of course, canceled all civil flights. He also had a special emergency cabinet meeting. They evacuated several large buildings here as well. The horrific occurrence in the United States has rippled right across the world. Tony Blair had this statement to make a little bit earlier tonight.
I have just chaired an emergency meeting of the British Government Civil Contingencies Committee, and I would like to explain some of the measures that we have agreed to take here. There are a range of precautionary measures. We have stepped up security at airports to the highest levels. No flights will take off from the United Kingdom for which we cannot apply the highest standards of security for aircrew and passengers. Private flights have been stopped except where specifically authorized. Flight paths into London have been changed so there will be no civil overflights of central London. Security has been increased across the full range of government buildings and military premises. The police across the whole of the UK are on full alert. All our defence facilities around the world have been moved to high alert to ensure the protection of British service personnel. Advice has been given to major financial and business institutions about appropriate security measures. A number of other security measures have been taken, and of course we are in close touch with US, European and other allies and are cooperating with them on issues of security. All relevant ministers remain in communication, and the committee, the Civil Contingencies Committee, will meet again tomorrow at 8 a.m. Obviously, some of these measures, not least the effect upon airports, will lead to some disruption, and I hope people understand that. But other than the specific measures we have taken, or that we have advised others to take, business and everyday life can continue as normal. As for those that carried out these attacks, there are no adequate words of condemnation. Their barbarism will stand as their shame for all eternity. As I said earlier, this mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it. This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy. And we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
The British Prime Minister very eloquently put into words what many world leaders are telling both their cabinets and their armed forces. The Germans called this act in America mass murder. The French said it needs to be eradicated. Tom?
NBC's Keith Miller, who is in our London bureau tonight with a roundup of European reaction and specifically the reaction of British Prime Minister Tony Blair. On the phone with me now is Warren Rudman, former senator from New Hampshire, national security affairs expert and co-chairman of the U.S. Commission on National Security. Senator Rudman, we've been hearing from one official after another that they were not surprised that there was a terrorist attack, but they were stunned by the complexity and the efficiency and the sophistication of this one. Do you share that?
No, I don't. I certainly was not surprised, and I'm not the least bit surprised at the extraordinary efficiency in which these horrible people carried out this attack against defenseless American citizens. But, you know, from what I have looked at over the last few years, we're dealing with some very sophisticated people who are very well financed and, given the time, can carry out attacks of this kind, as well as the thing that we all worry about, and that is attacks with weapons of mass destruction, as opposed to today's attack, which was a weapon of mass disruption.
But this had so many moving parts to it. Where was our intelligence community?
Well, of course, Tom, the first thing people want to ask is that question. It's a legitimate question, and we've looked at it, and we looked at it in our commission, which, of course, defined this issue as the #1 security issue facing America. Unfortunately, these are very difficult targets to penetrate. Some of these organizations, we don't even know that they exist. You can't get operatives into their midst. Very hard to find out who they are, where they are. My suspicion is that the people who carried out these attacks are people who have been probably filtered into this country over a period of months or years and have planned the attack and found a way to penetrate airport security. Once they did that, and they had people able to operate the aircraft, obviously what followed is no surprise.
Senator, how is this country going to have to change in the immediate aftermath of this declaration of war? And it's nothing short of that.
Well, it is a declaration of war. I compared it this morning in many ways to the country's attitude about defense in the 1930s or 1940, and then Pearl Harbor happened, and this country galvanized itself into action. This is another Pearl Harbor. This is a horrible attack on defenseless American citizens. I'm sorry to say I don't think it's the last. We have to do a lot with our intelligence, but more importantly, I think we have to do something about reorganizing our defense of this homeland into a rational organization that can deal with the aftermath, which, as you in New York can see, is just too horrible and too complex to contemplate. We've got to do that, and I must say that both the Congress and the administration have reacted to our report, which was issued in March. People are starting to look at ways to do this. It will take some time, but I hope not too much time.
There was going to be a very big debate in Washington, as you know, about the missile defense shield and about the reorganization of the United States military. Do you think the emphasis will now shift?
Well, Tom, I can only speak for the 12 or 13 members of this commission, and I will read to you just one short sentence. And we said, quote, "This commission believes that the security of the American homeland from the threats of the new century should be the primary national security mission of the U.S. government. With all due respect to the things you speak of, it is our collective belief that this nation has to organize itself both to try to prevent these things from happening and, as important, to find ways to deal with them when they do happen, as they will inevitably with the kind of determined foe that we are facing."
Thank you very much, former New Hampshire Senator Warren Rudman. We are looking at stunning pictures once again of people in lower Manhattan as they began to flee the canyons of Manhattan when the World Trade Center, first one building, one tower, and then the other began to come down. There is a real funnel effect in those narrow corridors in lower Manhattan, and the winds did take on a kind of tornado-like force. Ron Insana and others who work for NBC who were in the midst of all that described it as pitch dark and terrifying for a full 2 minutes at least. Many of them had to seek sanctuary either by breaking through windows, as Ashley Banfield did, into an apartment building, or getting into a car. CNBC's Ron Insana remains with us now. Ron, you've now been able to see those other videotapes that we've been showing of what it's like down there, and I think you used the phrase earlier, nuclear winter, and that's so apt.
And Tom, in some ways, I mean, if you can envision again that scene in Independence Day, that terrifying alien movie that showed New York City exploding in a horrific fireball without the fire, that is exactly what the corridors in Lower Manhattan looked like. That's those huge plumes of smoke ripping through the streets and really overwhelming the entire community. It stretched for many, many blocks, the after effects of the implosion of that building. And to be standing in the middle of it, it was indeed pitch black. And had there not been an open car in which to hide, I'm not quite sure in what capacity I would be right now. But for quite a considerable time after the building came down, the air in Lower Manhattan was thick, deep gray, unbreathable in many ways. Many people trying to take refuge in buildings that were open to the extent that there were some, or in automobiles, or any place where they could get breathable air.
All right, CNBC's Ron Insana, who was one of the survivors today when he went through to cover the story, and then the building began to come down. No one could have anticipated that it would happen as swiftly or as catastrophically as it did. It does lead one to wonder whether there was a secondary explosion of some kind within the building, although it did take, in both instances, a terrible, terrible hit at the top. These buildings are secure. The World Trade Center was bombed in 1993. It managed to survive that. But nonetheless, the full effect of these two airliners, both considerable in size with a lot of fuel on board, brought down two of the iconic buildings in Manhattan. Let's go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell now, who has been keeping track of national security matters and the State Department. Secretary of State Colin Powell is en route back from Peru, we're told. Andrea, do we think he'll come to Washington?
That's correct, Tom. We're not sure that he will come to Washington. He's en route back from Lima, Peru. He was to have gone to Bogota, Colombia today, never got that far. He was at an OAS, an Organization of American States meeting in Lima, Peru, and gave a statement about this terrible attack on our nation, an attack which he described as a military attack, and then left. We're not sure where he is going to be going. As you know, the vice president is at a secure location, Mrs. Bush at a secure location. Condoleezza Rice, the national security advisor, was conducting National Security Council meetings in the Situation Room at the White House, even though the White House was evacuated. The State Department Operations Center relocated across the river to another location in Virginia. And George Tenet, the CIA director, was still holding meetings, but in a secure, separate location in Langley, while the rest of the CIA did evacuate. The CIA director on February 7th testified to the Senate Intelligence Committee that there was one person who was capable of coordinated, sophisticated, multiple attacks on the United States with no warning, and that was Osama bin Laden. Now, obviously, there are other collateral groups such as Al-Qaeda in Egypt, based in Egypt, that are closely associated with him. And it's very easy to, as Warren Rudman has warned us against, to speak without knowing fully who is really responsible. But clearly, he is top on their list of possible suspects because of motive, because of means, because of opportunity, because of finances. And as Senator Rudman pointed out to you, this is the kind of attack, Tom, that had to be organized for many, many months. Just as we discovered during the testimony by bin Laden associates who were turned by the FBI and testified in the World Trade Center bombing trial, and also in the trial, of course, of the embassy bombings. These people work for months in advance. This is not a response, let's say, to recent events in the Middle East. This is something that was in the planning for many, many, many months.
Yeah, this is a terrible wake-up call for America. So many times we're lulled into the impression that far-off events don't have an effect on us in this country, or when there is a shooting at the CIA, as there was a few years ago, or when we had the bombing of the World Trade Center. Those trials went on, didn't generate a lot of attention. But Andrea, let's talk for just a moment, if we can, about foreign policy in the United States, about what was on the agenda before this day. The president was going to China in October. The UN meeting will be coming up in the fall. How will all this be affected?
Well, all of these events will be affected in extraordinary ways. We had already seen that economic and global meetings could no longer be held without not only the threat of protests, but without massive protests interrupting the schedule of international gatherings. The UN meetings in New York in September were already going to be very, very difficult to conduct, always have been, as you know. But now it is difficult to imagine how the president can travel safely, how other officials can gather for these international meetings without such an extraordinary degree of protection that the meetings cannot be held as originally envisioned and cannot be held really very effectively. We've seen not only the comments from Europe, but we've seen comments from the top leaders in China and elsewhere, all government leaders horrified by what has happened here in the United States. But this really will change us in profound ways. You and Tim Russert were talking about the psychological effects. We thought after the embassy bomb attacks, when airport security was stepped up so importantly, that we were in a new world, but now we've seen, much to the shock of most Americans, that we are vulnerable to hijackings. We thought that hijackings were events of the 80s domestically here in the United States, not of the late 90s and turn of the century. So this is really a new world as far as our own sense of vulnerability, especially as we travel.
Thank you very much, NBC's Andrea Mitchell. We're told now by the FAA that the ground stop, that is, all flights in this country, commercial flights and other private aircraft, have been grounded until at least noon tomorrow. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager, who's been monitoring the situation for us at the FAA. Bob?
Right, Tom. It's all domestic flights, all commercial domestic flights. The prohibition on takeoffs and landings lasts at least until noon tomorrow, and then at that point they'll reassess it, so it may go beyond that. And then the same holds for international flights, all outbound flights to Europe and Asia, or anywhere, South America, and any inbound flights from overseas or foreign countries. All that is grounded at least until noon tomorrow, and then the agency will reassess it after that.
Bob, when you said all commercial flights will be grounded, what about private planes as well? There's a huge traffic in that these days.
Yeah, and it would apply to all private flights as well. Now, there are some areas where it's more difficult for the FAA to police because they don't have the towers and they don't have the airports manned. But it is to be a ground on all air travel. And I wouldn't be absolutely positive on all of the general aviation flights. And I know, of course, there'll be some exceptions for humanitarian reasons where you have to move, particularly people who are dealing with this crisis here and there. So there'd be those sorts of exceptions. But what I do know is that scheduled domestic flights and scheduled international flights, inbound and outbound, everything is grounded until midday tomorrow.
All right, thanks very much. NBC's Robert Hager. We've been talking about this in a kind of large sense without personalizing it because we don't know, first of all, how many people were killed altogether. 266 died in the airplane crashes. We can only suspect that some of them will be well known because these were flights from Washington, from Boston to Los Angeles. That was American Airlines Flight 11. That was the first one to go into the World Trade Center. 92 people on board. Flight 77 and another American Airlines flight was headed from Dulles to Los Angeles with 62 on board. Those flights from the capital to the West Coast always have prominent people on board. Flights 175, United Airlines, Boston to Los Angeles, 65 on board, and Flight 93, Newark to San Francisco, 45 on board. All transcontinental flights with a heavy load of fuel. This is Mayor Giuliani of New York City. Let's join his news conference live.
It's something that we've had nightmares about, but probably thought wouldn't happen. My heart goes out to all of the innocent victims of this horrible and vicious act of terrorism, acts of terrorism. And our focus now has to be on saving as many lives as possible. We have hundreds of police officers and firefighters who are engaging in rescue efforts in Lower Manhattan. I want to thank Governor Pataki for the incredible cooperation and coordination, and including deploying the National Guard that will be available to relieve our police officers and firefighters and emergency workers in the next couple of hours. The governor and I just spoke to the President of the United States. The coordination with the federal government from the time of the first attack has been excellent, including closing off the airspace around Manhattan and doing everything that can possibly be done in the face of this barbaric act to make the city secure. And we will strive now very hard to save as many people as possible and to send a message that the city of New York and the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists, that our democracy, that our rule of law, that our strength and our willingness to defend ourselves will ultimately prevail. And I'd ask the people of New York City to do everything that they can to cooperate, not to be frightened, to go about their lives as normal. Everything is safe right now in the city, and the people who are doing the relief effort need all the help they can get. And then, Governor, thank you very much for your assistance and your help and your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, for your leadership through this crisis. This is a vicious attack upon New York. It's an attack upon America. It's an attack upon the whole concept of freedom and our way of life. And we cannot let these attacks succeed. The first step has to be to make sure we do everything in our power to protect the people and to save the lives of those whose lives are still at risk, and to help those who have been injured. And I want to commend the mayor, and I want to thank my colleagues from Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the federal government have all offered and made ready support to help us deal with this ongoing crisis. The people of New York are not only the freest and most diverse people in the world, we're also, I believe, the most capable of rising to meet the challenges of this type of attack. And right now, we want New Yorkers to remain calm, to go about their business, to appreciate the fact that everything to provide for their safety is being done, to appreciate that everything that can be done to provide for the health and the needs of the people who are still at risk is being done, and that we will continue to work to make sure that we get through this as strongly and quickly as possible. I want to thank the federal administration. Secretary Thompson has been on the phone with me a number of times, as well as the president, for what they are offering and prepared to do. And we're just confident that, well, this is a horrible attack, and one that is despicable and really unthinkable in its magnitude. We will get through this, and we will continue to have a great and free country, state, and society.
Do we know the number of casualties at this point, sir?
I don't think we really want to speculate about that. The number of casualties will be more than any
Mayor Giuliani
of us can
and
bear.
Governor Pataki, the two Republican leaders of this state, joined together here in this day of common tragedy for them and dealing with a crisis of unbelievable proportions for both of them. Is this city has been struck in an act of war by terrorists. You're looking now at the Manhattan Bridge, which leads out of lower Manhattan into the various boroughs. That one going over into Brooklyn. Those of you who come to New York always remember the Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Williamsburg Bridge in that sequence from the lower part of the city on BMW. These are people who didn't have access to subways or cars because the tunnels are closed, and they're walking home, as any number of people are. New York, as Governor Pataki said, is so diverse in so many ways, but it is always united with the enormous sense of pride and survival and people helping each other as they are today. And that is the lower end of Manhattan, one of the great cities in the world that has been struck in an act of war today by two hijacked airliners, the hijackers unknown. Richard Shelby of Alabama, Senator, Senate Intelligence Committee. We're told that you've been getting a briefing. What do we know at this hour, Senator?
I've had a partial briefing, but after 4 o'clock this afternoon, I've been told that some people with the CIA and the FBI is going to brief Senator Bob Graham, who is the chairman of the committee. I'm the vice chairman. I was a former chairman. As to the events, what they know up to this point, who's responsible at this point. It's a little premature, but about 30 minutes ago I was talking to some people. Everybody's deeply concerned about what happened. We should be. You mentioned war. This is war. I've said several times that this is a different type of war. It has no boundaries. We've been pushing the intelligence committees for 7 years now that I've been on the committee to do everything they can, and I think we've got to do more. But my first thoughts, Tom, go out to the families. You know, this is a terrible, terrible day for America. It's a wake-up call, though.
And what do we do after we get the wake-up call in terms of how this country must change? Obviously, security at airports will have to be tightened considerably when you have 4 planes taken, including one from the nation's capital. What else is going to have to happen?
Well, that's one, and I think we can do much better around the airports. I think we've come a long way with security. We're an open society. We want to stay that way because that's what makes this country great. We cannot hunker down and live in bunkers. We will not, I predict. But I think we can do a lot more. I'm waiting the briefing as to see if there was any inkling, any warning whatsoever. If not, then this was a heck of a well-executed, dastardly deed today. And I'm afraid it'll be more.
And that's the other question I was going to ask you in that partial briefing. Did you get any assurance that the worst seems to be over?
No, they wouldn't say that. They would be very careful as to saying what would come next because nobody knows that. But we are on alert. The president has put the military on alert all around the world. That's good. I guess we're going to have to stay on alert to some extent, be alert to possibilities because this is a dangerous groups that we're dealing with now.
Is the president going to have to stay out of Washington for 24 hours?
I don't know. I'll leave that up to him. He will be advised by the people who give him security warnings and so forth. But I think sooner or later the president will come to the Capitol. He should come to the Capitol and reassure the American people. But that will be up to him, Tom.
All right, Senator Richard Shelby, Vice Chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, thank you very much for being with us today. We'd like to be able to talk with you again if we can after that 4 o'clock briefing. I know you can't give away details, but if we can invite you back, Senator, we'd like to do that. Let's go to NBC's Campbell Brown now, who is covering the White House from outside the fence. Campbell?
Well, Tom, we don't know where the president is right now, and that is, of course, deliberate given the security concerns. They are going to great extremes to protect him at this moment. He started off the day in Florida, then flew to the Barksdale Air Force Base, which is in Louisiana, near Shreveport, North Louisiana. And it was there that he made a statement reacting to the attacks this morning. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense.
Now, Tom, we are told that the president took off from Barksdale Air Force Base for an unknown location. There are any number of places that he could have been taken. The most likely is a series of command centers that are set up across the country, all over the country, that are essentially communication centers where the president could speak with the military, where he could have access to the latest intelligence information. And the military officer who travels with the president at all times, this is the military officer who carries the nuclear codes, he also has a database with him of all of these communication centers around the country. All of them, or most of them rather, underground, where the president could both be protected and have that access, the most advanced electronics equipment that could give him access to his entire team, whoever he needed to talk to. Two in particular are worth noting here. One is Camp David. Underground at Camp David, there is a facility there, a special communication center, and of course Camp David is in Maryland along the Pennsylvania-Maryland border. There is another place in that same location, Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, near the Pennsylvania-Maryland border, again, called Raven Rock. And Raven Rock is the alternate National Military Command Center or Communication Center. If the Pentagon is the primary place where military operations are conducted from, Raven Rock is the backup location. Now, these two are worth noting, and we have no confirmation that they are in any way related to the plane crash near Pittsburgh, but they are in the vicinity of that plane crash in Pittsburgh and possibly could have been targets. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Campbell Brown. As these stories begin to unfold throughout the day, we're still operating really on two planes. It is surrealistic, but at the same time, it is one of the darkest days in America as we realize that this country has been attacked in an act of terrorist war. in the heart of the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., and also in New York City, and then a plane that was driven into the ground outside of Pittsburgh. We believe that that is the end of the attacks for now, but no one is sure because we don't know who is responsible. Let's go to NBC's Jim Miklashevsky, who was in the Pentagon when that plane was driven into the Pentagon today. He heard a small explosion. Don Rumsfeld wouldn't get out at first, but I gather he, too, has been taken to a secure location.
Actually, Tom, what Don Rumsfeld did, according to Pentagon officials, is he was in his office on the opposite side of the building from where you see where the plane impacted, and he ran to the area where the fire and the fireball was still engulfing much of the Pentagon. And according to Pentagon officials, he actually assisted in helping some of the injured leave the building before he then returned to his office and then went straight to the National Military Command Center, again on the opposite side of the Pentagon, to monitor events where he now remains. Tom, this airplane that ran into the Pentagon, it happened within the hour from the two planes that ran into the World Trade Center, but it took a full 4 hours before firefighters and rescue workers could actually contain the flames and fire inside, so it was safe enough for them to enter the building. And that was about an hour ago when we were told that rescue workers did enter parts of the building where you can see where the plane sliced through the Pentagon. Now, it was actually fortuitous that the plane hit in this area, if that can be described as fortunate at all. As you see, Tom, the plane sliced through the building. It came in at an angle, flipped over on its right side, and hit actually at about the first and second floors. The third, fourth, and fifth floors were still intact immediately after the blast, but then later collapsed upon themselves. But to the right of that devastated area, you see there's not much fire damage. That's because that part of the building had recently been renovated with reinforced blast walls to prevent a kind of bomb attack, not an airplane attack, of course, but to prevent a bomb attack, and reinforced firewalls on the inside after the bombing at Oklahoma City. When the remodeling of the Pentagon was begun, it was decided to do it with extra reinforcement after Oklahoma City. Now, this area to the left, where you see most of the fire damage, that area was due to be remodeled shortly. And fortunately, a large number of those offices had already been evacuated. Now, there are confirmed dead, many injured. We don't know the exact number yet. And as rescue workers dig through that rubble, certainly the death toll here is going to climb. But really, it could have probably been much worse had this area on the right not been reinforced and the area on the left not been abandoned, really, to permit the redevelopment or reconstruction work that was to go underway. Now, according to eyewitnesses, it was an American Airlines 757 that came sort of from the direction of National Airport, and it just cleared the highway, which is adjacent, the highway ramps, which is adjacent to the Pentagon, but then it came in, and as it approached the Pentagon, almost at ground level, did a very hard right turn and actually flipped on its side and then sliced into the Pentagon on the first and second floors we see there. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC Jim Miklashevsky. In both that flight and the first flight, the American Airlines flight that hit here in New York, had similar patterns. They were flying at very, very low altitude, 1,000 feet, according to some New York witnesses. And Bob Kerr said earlier that over Lafayette Park, just outside the White House, they saw a plane go over at a very low altitude that was out of the normal flight pattern for Washington, D.C. So obviously this had been well thought out. That goes without saying. The question is, what happened in the cockpit? Did the terrorists take the controls and drive those planes into the World Trade Center as well as into the Pentagon? And where was that plane that went down in Pennsylvania headed? Why did it go down there? Well, these were all flights that were originally headed for California. We don't have the tapes, obviously. The black box may be able to tell us something. This is the second plane going that you can see entering from right to left there that hit the second Trade Center tower at the World Trade Center here in New York, causing that enormous fireball That is the first tower to go down. It was hit a little bit lower. It went down first, and the second one went down as well. So there are so many unanswered questions here. All across America, we know that people are watching with horror and with a great deal of apprehension. There are lessons to be learned from past experiences. Oklahoma City comes immediately to mind. Assistant Fire Chief was John Hanson, who became a very familiar figure and a friend to a lot of us, who's been through all of this. He's now retired from the department in Oklahoma City. John, first of all, this whole business of getting people out of the rubble in New York City and in the Pentagon, but the larger lessons about what we should learn about how we move on from here. What did you learn in Oklahoma City?
You know, Tom, that we can in fact do that. We were, stung, we were wounded, but we're not going to be defeated, and we won't in this one. You've heard the president, Mayor Giuliani, the governor of New York, all make the comments that we're going to stick together and get through this. We've got to be patient. We've got an incredible rescue effort that's going to take possibly months. You know, our rescue effort in Oklahoma City took 17 days. This, with the widespread destruction, will probably go into the months. We've just got to be patient and pull together and just take this head on.
There's so much that we learn from Oklahoma City as well in terms of rescue organization and rescue techniques.
You know, Tom, we had a team from the great state of New York in Oklahoma City. After Oklahoma City, the nation's fire service, FEMA, we all got together, reevaluated what we were doing. The New York City Fire Department is as prepared as any department in the country to handle this. With the support of FEMA and the rest of us around the country, we're going to help those great men and women get through this, just as they helped us back in 1995.
John, tell me, just from a personal point of view, where were you when you heard what had happened today, and what was your first reaction?
Tom, I was at home, and I heard about the devastation during the Today Show, watching Katie and Matt, and it just felt like I'd been gut punched, as the rest of the country. I stopped for a moment, looked at the video that we saw on the Today Show, and just really couldn't believe it at a point, and then reflected on Oklahoma City and knew that we all had to go to work, band together, and help each other get through this, and we will. That's the beauty about America. We'll pull together and we'll get through this and send a message to the cowards who perpetrated this great crime against our nation.
Thanks so much. John Hanson from Oklahoma City, who went through his own trial by fire and shares with us today some of the lessons after the Murrah Federal Building was bombed, and he became such a familiar and reassuring figure to so many of us. We have some information that I can bring you up to date on now. The mayor here in New York said that 1,500 people have been brought to the Liberty State Park area, that is in the lower end of Manhattan, for those of you who come here from time to time, not too far from where the ferries go back and forth to Staten Island and over to the Statue of Liberty. 600 have been brought to the New York City area hospitals. 150 of those are in critical condition. New Jersey hospitals have not yet reported in. It's fair to say that that's about 2,100 altogether. Those are the people who have been recovered. We can only guess at how many hundreds more are trapped in the rubble on the ground or in what is left of the buildings. 30 patients, this is in the Washington, D.C. area, 30 people have been brought to Arlington to the hospital at the VA Center in Arlington. 13 have been admitted, 8 are in intensive care, 4 are on ventilators. They have discharged 6 patients so far. There are a variety of injuries, blast injuries and smoke inhalation, which is always a huge problem. Burns, fractures, several patients are critically ill, perhaps 8 altogether. There have been no fatalities brought to that hospital, the VA Center in Arlington, although earlier the Pentagon did say that there were people who were killed in the attack on the Pentagon. St. Mary's Hospital in Hoboken, back to New York again. 450 people have been brought at the Hoboken PATH station triage center. PATH is a train that goes underneath the river over to New Jersey, and so they were treating him right there as a triage center. Mostly minor injuries. Of those injuries are cuts, bruises, burns, broken bones, and so on. So that's a quick update on what is going on at LAX, which is closed down, as are all airports across America. NBC Shelley Smith reports authorities may soon detonate a suspicious device found at the airport. On a day like this, there are any number of suspicious devices and calls that are made by demented people claiming that there's a bomb on board a plane or a bus or in a school somewhere. We're trying to track those down. There have been no other incidents so far as we know across America beside those that we have been witness to here at the World Trade Center, at the Pentagon, and of course that plane that went into the ground outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. NBC's Robert Hager. Robert, what's the latest there at the FAA?
Tom, you were mentioning about imagining what could have gone on in the cockpits, and really there are two basic scenarios in a hijacking. Either you have the hijacker standing there with a gun at the pilot's head or an explosive device of some kind ordering the pilot to make the maneuvers on the plane, or you have the hijacker actually taking over from the pilot and operating the controls of the plane himself. Now this is all speculative, but just an opinion here. I think to hit a precise target like the World Trade Center there and hit it right on the mark, that in this case you'd have to have the hijacker at the actual controls of the plane, because it's hard for me to imagine how you would force a pilot, even gun at his head or anything else, at the last moment. A single jerk of the plane's equipment could manage to miss the tower of the World Trade Center, perhaps go into the river, or imagine the Pentagon. You could go into a parking lot or an area right around there if you could jerk the yoke of the plane at the last moment. So I'm guessing that it's much more likely that the hijackers somehow disabled the crew and took over the control of these planes. But we may know eventually, because presumably the cockpit voice recorder has survived on each of these 4 airplanes, and the cockpit voice recorder would give you the actual conversation in the cockpit. Sometimes you can't precisely reconstruct what went on from what's being said back and forth, but the cockpit voice recorders of those 4 planes should give you at least everything that was said in the cockpits.
All right, thank you very much, NBC's Robert Hager. We're looking now.
Tom, there's one little bit of information just handed to me. We were talking about how many planes are still in the air. We said all the domestic planes had landed, and we now hear that there are 10 to 12 international flights, all of them bound into the West Coast, so presumably they were on the long Pacific run, or else the even longer Europe to the West Coast run. The 10 to 12 international flights still in the air. That's the last of it. All the domestic flights, as we'd said before, have landed.
But they have failed. Our country is strong.
This is wild.
Through the night with the light from above, from the mountains to the prairies, to the ocean, white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
This is an NBC News special report. Attack on America. Here is Tom Brokaw.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is day 2 of America's war with terrorists, a war against a shadowy and cold-blooded enemy willing to kill anyone to advance their cause. This is the destruction in New York City alone. The twin trade towers of the World Trade Center collapsing completely, trapping thousands of people in the rubble as the rescue efforts continue. They'll go on for an indeterminate length of time. No one knows for sure how many people may be alive. No one can say how many people may in fact be dead, but the numbers are in the thousands. And that's the USS George Washington. It's off the coast of Long Island. It is providing military support and air cover for the eastern seaboard. The president today did in fact use the phrase, "We are at war with these terrorists." What they did to us was a declaration of active war. The most frantic rescue efforts are underway in lower Manhattan, of course, and NBC's David Bloom is in a position to tell us what is going on there now. David?
Well, Tom, this is a haunting, even demoralizing vantage point from which to see the immense destruction and the incredible rescue effort that's going on here in lower Manhattan. We are on Church Street, 6 blocks north of where the World Trade Center used to stand. And if we push in off into the distance, you can see the still smoking hulk of the South Tower, the number 2 tower of the World Trade Center. Tom, it is just an incredible scene here in the sense that you can see the rescue workers who have been here literally since more than some 28 hours now from when this first explosion occurred just around 9 a.m. yesterday. Most of them, if you look down, you can see the rescue workers, firefighters mixed in with police officers, as well as National Guard troops here on the scene. Many of them wearing the masks because the debris and the filter in the air is still spewing up. Having said that, we do know of some small successes that have occurred thus far. To the best of our knowledge at this hour, 8 individuals have been rescued from the scene. 5 firefighters, 3 police officers since last night, pulled from the rubble alive. You can see, Tom, if we pan down here onto the street, some of the rescue workers coming out. Many of these individuals have been inside just 6 blocks to the south for much of this morning. They come out, they essentially grab a quick bite to eat, grab some water, turn around and go back inside. You might also be able to spot the Humvee with the machine gun on top. As we mentioned, National Guard troops now deployed here in Lower Manhattan, not because there's been any trouble, but really merely to help the police and the firefighters. Of course, it has been a horrific 28 hours. Here's the sequence of events as we put them together thus far. Amidst the devastation, a glimmer of hope. Today, authorities say 5 New York City firefighters and 1 police officer were pulled from the wreckage, in addition to the 2 police officers rescued last night. And there may be others still trapped inside the World Trade Center's collapsed remains. Reports of cell phone calls from a few survivors pleading for help.
We do know there are people in the building that are alive. We know that for a fact. We're very hopeful that there are pockets where there are people, not only the ones that we know about, but hopefully others.
The president today condemns the attacks and vows to punish those responsible.
The United States of America will use all our resources to conquer this enemy. We will rally the world. We will be patient, we will be focused, and we will be steadfast in our determination. This battle will take time and resolve, but make no mistake about it, we will win.
But elsewhere, the news is grim. The president last night puts the death toll from the attacks in the thousands after an estimated 12 to 20 terrorists wielding makeshift knives hijacked 4 domestic airliners. Brand new video obtained overnight shows the first attack plane crashing into the World Trade Center's North Tower. Minutes later, television helicopters record the second plane crashing into the South Tower. The 2 110-story buildings so badly damaged that they collapse, one after the other. Among the missing...
That was the scene yesterday as recounted by David Bloom. There are some late developments. NBC's Pete Williams, who's our Justice Department correspondent, has been talking on the telephone with federal law enforcement officials. They say that some arrests are being made this morning in connection with the terrorist attacks. They're describing these people as material witness warrants. The officials say the arrests are being made when the people decline to answer questions or otherwise cooperate. This is at the Westin Copley Hotel. The FBI bomb squad is inside. That's in Boston. 2 of the flights originated at Logan Airport in the Boston area, obviously. We don't know whether this is, in fact, just a report of a bomb or if they, in fact, have found one. It's the Westin Copley Hotel in Boston. And we're going to go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell now, who is in Washington as well. She's been tracking not only the national security matters, but this law enforcement investigation that is going around the world. So, Andrea, Pete Williams is reporting that they are now issuing some material witness warrants for arrest in this case.
Exactly. Now, we should stress that these are not in any way necessarily people who are complicit or are involved in the acts of terror. These are material witness warrants for people who may have seen something or may have some other tangential involvement, people who may have perhaps even unwittingly assisted these terrorists along the way. But as you know, the FBI spread out in Florida following up a clue from one of the flight manifests and did an extensive search in Broward County, Florida last night. And we have other reports from other members of the NBC News team. Julie Holstein reporting that in Portland, Maine, a police chief spoke at a press conference this morning, Tom, and said that the FBI had directed his department to focus on 2 men who were on the U.S. air flight that left Maine at 6 a.m. yesterday and that landed at Logan at 6:30 a.m., where, of course, they could have connected to several of the other flights, to 2 other flights. The FBI believes, Tom, that the 2 men spent Monday night in Maine, that they rented a blue Nissan Optima from Alamo car rental in Maine, that they had carry-on bags and had to go through security again at Logan because the plane was in a different concourse. So they are really zeroing in on a number of these players. People on the manifest, and also, as you point out from Pete Williams' note, the FBI now putting out arrest warrants for people who may have been material witnesses.
All right, that's NBC's Andrea Mitchell in Washington. We continue to watch these developments in Boston. The crowd has been pushed back from that hotel, which is in the heart of Boston. Let's listen for just a few moments to our affiliates' coverage there, WHDH Television, Channel 7 in Boston.
And so it's hard to try and figure out how the two connect.
I try to regain contact with Christine McKenna. I'll ask our producers to do that as we talk once again with Garvin Thomas, who's at Copley Plaza right now. Garvin?
Jonathan, I guess it's a very strange scene out here. Obviously, by now, I would say the crowd that is outside here is probably numbering in the thousands of people just on the street alone. I notice a crowd that's gathered across the street in front of the Copley Plaza Hotel as well. Everybody wondering what is going on here, trying to figure out if it has any connection to what happened in New York City yesterday. As I said, the scene is about a half an hour old when the first emergency workers responded to a call here at the Westin Hotel. We've seen quite a response. As I said, I can count 3 ambulances in front. There was a SWAT team which arrived about 15-20 minutes ago. I'd say about a dozen members, fully outfitted in their Kevlar gear and helmets and shields. I think I noticed a battering ram at one point going in. They carried in some cases as well, which I can only speculate might be some materials used to investigate or defuse bombs, or maybe some crime scene investigation tape. They went in about 15 minutes ago. The police have not been too concerned with the safety, it appears, of the people who are outside the area now. It appears they have not evacuated the hotel. As I look up on some of the floors and peer in some of the windows, I noticed some obviously very curious residents of the hotel. As you can see, another ambulance arriving on scene here. The picture you're looking at right now, courtesy of what we call our mass cam. It's located on top.
We're going to continue to monitor the situation in Boston, and we'll go immediately back to it as soon as there are some concrete developments. We want to return to Washington now, and NBC's Andrea Mitchell, as this investigation begins to take up pace. Andrea?
Well, as you know, Tom, what they have been doing for the last 24 hours or 36 hours since all of this developed was to go back over any intelligence, any warnings, any cues that might have been missed, and also to look prospectively. So you have intelligence operatives around the world from all of our agencies working together in Langley at the Counter-Terrorist Center, but also sending out directives to try to warn other terror groups not to think that the U.S. is vulnerable, not to try to make any kind of copycat attempt, not that anyone could, but there are freelancers, there are smaller operations that could try to imitate what has been achieved by these terrorists against the United States. And part of this is to look to see if anyone else is also making threats. Now, part of what they're doing, obviously, is also pursuing the investigation. And as we've been reporting since yesterday,